Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at part 2 of Oversimplified's Hitler. Well, holy cow. Yesterday's response to the first half of this video was overwhelming. It was by far the best first day to a video that I've ever had, and that's just an indication of the continued growth of this channel. So thank you for that. We also went over 25,000 subscribers yesterday. For those of you who aren't familiar with me, I've actually been on YouTube for the last 4 years in the form of a history and strategy gaming channel called History Guy Gaming. It started out as being called History Guy, and the idea was that I was going to do both the historical site videos and gaming content on the same channel. Well, then the plan was to split them into two, with one being History Guy and one being History Guy Gaming. Well, the problem was that right about a month after I started my channel, another person started a channel called The History Guy, and many of you may be familiar with his channel. His is called History Guy, History Deserves to be Remembered. He started his channel just like a month after mine, but his grew a lot more. I started getting a lot of accusations that I was copying off of him, even though my channel was older, so I changed the name to History Guy Gaming on my gaming channel, which I've had for the last 4 years. And this week coming up, we're going to pass the number of subscribers on that channel with this one. So it's a kind of a momentous occasion. But if you are into gaming and strategy gaming in particular, if you want to check that out, I have the link in the description of most videos to take you over to History Guy Gaming. Don't forget to subscribe to this one if you haven't already. Leave a comment and make sure you visit the original channel if you're able to see the original content. I know a lot of you are in countries where you can't see the original video. So let's dive into part 2 of Oversimplified's Hitler.
Since Germany's military had to be reduced, Hitler could no longer remain a soldier after the war, but he kept working for the army as an informant. After the war, communists in Germany had attempted a revolution, and the government was worried about communism in general. So Hitler was tasked with infiltrating and reporting on any new political parties that could pose a communist threat. A new party called the German Workers' Party threw up a whole bunch of red flags, so Hitler went along to one of their meetings, but found that they weren't communist at all. They were extreme right and shared many of his extreme beliefs, so he left the army and signed up to join the party. His fantastic speaking abilities impressed the party's leadership and supporters, and he very quickly rose to the top.
So you want an interesting look into those early parts of Hitler's life. Everything that's covered in this video so far and in the previous video. There was a miniseries a number of years ago that came out called Hitler, Rise of Evil. And it's actually on YouTube. The whole thing's on YouTube and you can watch it. Check it out, because not only is it a good look into the early days of Hitler, but the guy who plays him, who I've seen in a few other things, I think he played Rumpelstiltskin in Once Upon a Time on one of the networks, does a fantastic job, I think. He really has Hitler's mannerisms down and his dynamic way of speaking. I think he does a good job with that. So I think it's a good, at least a way of introducing yourself to that part of Hitler's early life, so that you can learn a little bit more about what formed him into who he was, because a lot of it focuses on when he went and infiltrated the German Workers' Party, became one of their speakers, and then eventually kind of took this party over when they became the national, what we call the Nazi Party today.
He decided the party needed a makeover, so he renamed it to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi for short, and he gave it a new color scheme. The Nazis weren't very specific on policy, but Hitler made extravagant promises to return Germany to its former glory by undoing the Treaty of Versailles and reuniting all ethnic Germans into one nation. He also said that only pure Aryan people should be allowed to be citizens, and that all Jews would lose their citizenship. These ideas were already common in extreme right politics, but what set the Nazis apart was Hitler himself, and they quickly became the leading party on the extreme right. Many of the political parties in Germany at the time had paramilitary wings, and the Nazis were no different. Hitler set up the very descriptive Whole Protection Detachment, later changed to the very delightful Gymnastic and Sports Division, and finally settling on the ominous Storm Detachment, or SA for short.
And they called them the brown shirts for obvious reasons, and eventually the SA was actually gotten rid of in favor of the SS. The SA under Ernst Röhm eventually kind of became a threat to Hitler, and part of what they called the Night of the Long Knives, which I'm sure they'll get to, was him removing the leadership of the SA so that he could actually take over the German army as a whole, since he was by that point in leadership in the country.
Their job was to defend Nazi party meetings and intimidate political opponents. and they would frequently engage in battles with communists on the streets. Since the Allies had demanded a reduction in Germany's military size, many trained soldiers were left unemployed. They liked the Nazi ideology, and it was only natural for them to join the SA, which grew larger and larger over time.
And speaking of former military, one of the people who initially bought into Hitler's ideology and the Nazi Party was Erich Ludendorff, who had been one of the commanding generals of the German army during World War I, but eventually he kind of got disillusioned with Hitler, saw how extreme he was getting, and pulled back from it.
The new democratic government that formed after World War I was pretty weak and ineffective. In order to pay reparations to the Allies, it started printing more money. The problem is that printing money doesn't actually give a country more money, it just makes money less valuable. So as the country printed more and more money, it became worth less and less, and the currency crashed. In 1919, one US dollar was worth about 4 German marks. By December 1923, one US dollar was equal to 4.2 trillion marks. The price of bread rose to 200 billion marks. Banknotes became worthless. Unsurprisingly, in such an economic crisis, Germany struggled to pay the Allies.
And when people are struggling like that, when you've got to take a wheelbarrow full of money to buy a loaf of bread, you will turn to anybody who's got an answer, who's got a solution, who's got an opportunity to try and get you out of it. So when people ask, why did people buy into Hitler? They didn't buy into him so much because of the extreme ideology, though there were people who certainly bought into that. It was because he offered them a way out. Imagine how desperate the situation was in Germany. And this all goes back to the Treaty of Versailles and the absolute disaster that was. The Treaty of Versailles created Nazi Germany. No ifs, ands, or buts about that.
The French were pissed about this, so they occupied the Ruhr, an area full of factories, and took the economic output from the area as payment. They treated the German civilians badly, and in total, approximately 130 Germans were killed during the occupation. Germans were furious, and Hitler and the Nazis thought that now would be a great time to lead a revolution. In November 1923, inspired by something a certain bold Italian man did a year earlier, Hitler stormed a meeting at a beer hall and called for an uprising against the government. With his supporters, he marched on the streets of Munich, hoping the police would join his side. They did not.
So they call that the beer hall putsch, which was basically an attempt to overthrow the Bavarian government. Remember, at this time, Germany, even though it's the Weimar Republic and it's kind of one nation, and before that was an empire, it's still made up of a bunch of different states. And some of those are their own kingdoms even. Prussia is the main one, but you have Bavaria is another one. And so they weren't attempting to overthrow the entire German government. They were attempting to overthrow the Bavarian government, if I understand that right.
Hitler was put on trial for treason. He could have been sentenced to life, but the right-wing judges thought he was a pretty cool guy. Hitler knew the judges and knew that they would be lenient, so he took the opportunity to make impassioned speeches during the trial. And in the end, he was sentenced to just 5 years in prison, of which he only served 9 months. And when I say prison, it was more like a pleasant hotel stay where he had plenty of time to write a book.
He actually dictated that book to Rudolf Hess, who eventually Rudolf Hess is the guy who would become the deputy Führer in Germany. And then he goes on this ill-fated attempt to make peace with the British and flies to and ends up, I think, parachuting into Scotland. And he spent the rest of his life in prison after that.
The whole affair was covered by the media nationwide, and it made Hitler famous. Hitler and his extreme message were now known throughout Germany. But the everyday German still didn't care much for him. In the 1928 election, the Nazis only won about 2% of the vote. Many were still intimidated by all the violence and the shouting and how unpolitician-like he was. But a new economic crisis would change all of that. To help Germany pay its reparations, America agreed to give it loans. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash happened, and America wanted its money back. The economic strain this put on an already struggling Germany was severe. Unemployment skyrocketed, poverty was widespread, and Germans were sick of it. It was clear that the newly formed democracy wasn't working. In the face of crisis, Germans began moving to the political extremes. If you were German and wanted change, your choices now were either the communists or the Nazis. Hitler claimed that he was the only one who could return Germany to its former glory. The Nazi Party used propaganda to make Hitler seem like a great and powerful man, and they gave the German people a scapegoat to blame for all their suffering. The promise of a single strong dictator was a breath of fresh air for Germans after years of failing democracy. Some bought into his extreme ideology. Some didn't agree with the racism, but were willing to vote for him anyway. Many didn't know much about politics at all, but just got caught up in the hype.
And this is important to understand. not everybody who voted for the Nazis was an extremist that wanted to murder all the Jews and wanted to buy into everything Hitler was saying. A lot of them just wanted food on the table. They just wanted a job. They just wanted somebody that was going to restore Germany to her former glory. And a lot of times people will vote for someone they don't fully agree with just because it's the best of all the bad alternatives. And some of them may have just not wanted to side with the communists. And like they said, those are your two choices at this point. And as I said before in other videos, Adolf Hitler hated communists every bit as much as he hated Jews. And a lot of times he lumped the two of them into the same category. And you'll see that later, that he does lump them into the same categories. And he also will end up blaming the communists for the Reichstag fire, among other things, which will help solidify his power.
Election after election, the Nazis became more and more popular until in 1932 they became the biggest party in the German parliament. Hitler came to truly believe that he was some sort of great, destined savior of Germany. He turned megalomaniac. He decided to run for president and did surprisingly well, but still lost to the extremely popular World War I general Paul von Hindenburg. Since he was now the leader of the biggest party though, he demanded President Hindenburg make him chancellor. But Hindenburg was reluctant, seeing that Hitler was clearly such a big racist. Industry leaders urged Hindenburg to give Hitler the chancellorship, fearing the rising support for communism, and leader of the Center Party von Papen, who had been secretly negotiating with Hitler, said to Hindenburg, "How about we make Hitler chancellor on the condition that I get to be vice-chancellor and most government jobs go to us moderate conservatives? That way, I'll get to keep my power. I mean, we'll get to keep our power and we'll control Hitler like he's our angry little puppet."
Interesting idea by a couple of guys who thought they could control Hitler but really underestimated him.
What could possibly go wrong? As it turned out, everything. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, but he was not yet a dictator. In February, the German parliament building was set on fire. Historians still aren't sure who did it, and many suspect the Nazis did it themselves, but Hitler blamed the communists, and he convinced President Hindenburg to sign an emergency decree allowing him to imprison all communists and other political opponents.
So, not that I typically want to get into sci-fi on this channel, but if you are a Star Wars fan at all, you have to notice the parallels between how Hitler comes to power and how Palpatine takes power in the Star Wars universe. He basically does the same thing. They create a conflict, they create a catastrophe that calls for him to ask to be voted emergency dictatorial powers, which he then never gives up. That's exactly what Hitler ends up doing.
Communists and others were sent off to the first concentration camp in Dachau. At this time, the elderly President Hindenburg passed away, giving Hitler the perfect opportunity. He introduced a law to Parliament that would allow him to make all future laws and decisions entirely on his own. With his political opponents imprisoned and the SA intimidating others, Hitler's law passed. Just 2 months after becoming Chancellor, Hitler was now a dictator. He still had one problem. The leader of the SA wanted the SA to take over the job of the regular German army, and the German army didn't like that idea. Hitler needed to maintain the support of his professionally trained German army, more so than his rough and rowdy SA. So one night in June 1934, he had Raoul and many other of his own SA officers rounded up and murdered.
And it wasn't just Ernst Röhm, it was pretty much any political opponent that Hitler needed to get out of the way that they dealt with during what they called the Night of the Long Knives.
While he was at it, he took the opportunity to brutally settle some personal scores as well. Politicians who had disagreed with him in the past, reporters who had printed negative articles about him, one guy who did absolutely nothing, but they thought he was someone else. In some cases, even their families were murdered. In total, up to 200 people were killed in what became known as the Night of the Long Knives. The army, now satisfied that they wouldn't be replaced, pledged total allegiance to their new Führer, and Hitler's control was now absolute. Life in Germany changed violently. Freedom of the press, expression, and public assembly were suspended. Jews were initially branded and their businesses boycotted. And eventually, Hitler would go on to have 6 million Jewish men, women, and children killed in concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced into sterilization for physical and mental imperfections. The Hitler Youth became a way to brainwash the young. Boys were trained to fight and returned home from camp violent. Girls were told their purpose was to have many pure Aryan children, and they would sometimes return from camp pregnant. When their parents were understandably horrified, Their children would threaten to turn them over to the Gestapo for standing in the way of Germany's greatness. The standard greeting changed, and you could be sent to a concentration camp for not using it. This way, it seemed like everyone was a Nazi supporter. If you dared oppose Hitler or speak out against him in any way, you also would be sent to a concentration camp.
And you see how quickly all this happened. They go in just a couple of years from being a democracy to by making the wrong decision about the party that they voted for because they were desperate for something to change. They end up putting this man in power, and they basically give up all their freedoms and cost almost an entire generation of people their lives, not only in Germany but throughout the world.
German nationalism captivated the young Adolf. Extreme ideology and anti-Semitism festered in him as a young man living a hard life on the streets. Germany's defeat in the First World War filled him with hatred and a thirst for vengeance. A political movement that treated him like a god, and hundreds of thousands looking up to him as their savior, made him a megalomaniac. And soon, his aggressive foreign policies would drag the world into a second tragic global conflict, otherwise known as...
And of course, we haven't talked about a lot of that stuff yet, World War II. I did do the World War II Oversimplified series, so if you want to check that out, I'll put the link at the end of this video here, so you can check that one out as well. But let me know your thoughts about Hitler's rise to power, what you see in that, or what are some other key things that maybe I didn't talk about that you think should be mentioned. Use the comment section below, and I will probably be bringing some more reaction videos to you from the road. I'm off to Fredericksburg, Virginia this afternoon, where I'm going to be the next several days shooting video for the channel, so be watching for those. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so when all of that content goes live, you won't miss it. And join the discussion with us over on Discord. Thanks for watching.